Luxembourg is a country with its eyes on the stars. And SnT at the University of Luxembourg is helping turn its science fiction dreams into an economic reality. Our researchers explore the challenges and opportunities of space hand in hand with industry-leading partners. From Earth-bound satellite receivers to nanosatellites and autonomous lunar robots, researchers at SnT infused Luxembourg's vibrant space industry with new perspectives and innovative solutions.
Welcome to another SpaceConnectsUs event, where we connect space experts, astronauts, and leaders from around the world with educational institutions, students, and online viewers. I'm Stuart Clark, an astronomer, author, and journalist. Today, we're talking entrepreneurship in space with special guest Chuck Beams, all the way from Washington, D.C., and the students of the University of Luxembourg's Interdisciplinary Space Masters program. Thank you all for being here. A journalist, businessman, and former Air Force colonel, Charles is the executive chairman of York Space Systems, a leader in commercial satellite design and manufacturing. He's also chairman of the SmallSat Alliance, an organization advocating for the future of this rapidly evolving industry. He's also a regular contributor to Forbes, covering the future of entrepreneurial space and what the proliferation of the new space movement means for industry stakeholders. So, Charles, thank you so much for joining us today.
Stuart, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to join you and all the students for an exciting hour. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you. As you say, we're also joined by students on the Interdisciplinary Space Masters program at the University of Luxembourg. And this innovative program balances business and technology. From rocket science to the management of space businesses, these students will acquire various skills in the Luxembourg space industry sector and develop the entrepreneurial mindset required to be successful in the emerging space industry. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. It's great to have you here. Now, before we begin, we'd just like to thank the Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust at the University of Luxembourg for sponsoring this SpaceConnectsUs event. They, along with the Luxembourg Space Agency, Broadcasting Centre Europe, SES Satellites, Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce, Eurocomposites, OHB Systems, and B612 Foundation make programs like SpaceConnectsUs possible. So thank you to all of you for your foresight and your support. So without further ado, Charles, tell us a bit about your journey into the business side of space.
Sure, thanks, Stuart. I'm probably unusual for a lot of folks. My space journey began when I was about 4 years old, and my father was an engineer in the Apollo program, and so as a young kid, we lived on the beach down in Florida, down at the Cape, and I remember watching live the Saturn V rockets launching there and being inspired really at a very, very young age. And from there I did the normal schooling that children do, and ended up going to the Air Force Academy for my undergraduate education. And then the Air Force sent me off to graduate school, first to Johns Hopkins University and then on to Georgetown for a bit. So had a great career in the Air Force following that, beginning more as a systems design guy, starting off as an instrument payload type. But what they typically do quickly is they try to move you through, and became a systems engineer, and then eventually what we would think of as a business manager in the commercial world, where I was a program manager for a number of the mostly classified, highly classified systems, but also in the more well-known programs like GPS and a lot of the launch systems. From there, I was an appointee in the last administration and responsible for all space and intelligence acquisitions in the Pentagon. It was about $80 billion a year. Enjoyed that. And then after I did that dance for a few years, went off and managed as the president of Vulcan Aerospace. I managed Paul Allen's big portfolio of aerospace investments. And then from there, kind of struck out on my own. And I've been doing, as you mentioned in the intro, been involved in quite a few things, which I'm happy to talk about later on. But the thing that is near and dear to my heart is York Space Systems, which is a builder of next generation satellites and end-to-end space solutions for commercial customers and for the government.
Yes, it's an exceptional CV, Charles. It really is. And your latest venture, sort of York Space Systems, it's really interesting. And I'd love to hear what a bit more about that company and this idea of sort of next generation satellites. What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, one of the things that, like any new industry, it goes through these evolutions, it goes through these turns, and the CubeSat market, which I think we're going to talk about later, was sort of the beginnings of this sort of new space thing. This idea that you can do a lot in a very small sort of package, and what I came to realize as I was getting to understand and know about 10, 12 years ago what was going on there, was that I could see that these technologies, that were being developed could be packaged into sort of a more robust satellite design that could be used for operational purposes rather than for demonstration or educational. And so I met my now business partner, Dirk Wallinger, and he and I have designed a company basically to do exactly that. And we arrived at a size, a payload mass, a satellite mass of, depending upon the customer, between say 150 to 200 kilograms, which is very large compared to say a CubeSat, but it's very, very small compared to a lot of the operational. We found that to be a sweet spot for the main business purpose that we wanted to do, which was to take and make space data very inexpensive for the world, both commercially and for different government purposes, and revolutionize our way of life.
Do you have sort of like a standard satellite platform that you use, and what sort of size is that?
We do, and we kind of, what we decided to do was, if you think about we borrow a lot of our ideas from the automotive industry, actually, but if you think about Toyota, for example, and they have, if you think of the spacecraft bus as the equivalent of the drivetrain and chassis on a car, the same drivetrain and chassis on a Toyota Sienna minivan, the Toyota Highlander, a Camry, the very sporty Solera, and I think there's a couple of other platforms. They all have the same drivetrain chassis, and that saves an immense amount of money. And that's one of the reasons why you're able to get, and even some of the Lexus platforms all use that same thing. You're able to get an incredible amount of technology and performance for really not that much money. And so we've kind of borrowed that same idea. We have what's called the S-Class platform, and that's what we are in rate production on. And then what we do is we offer customers options to tailor that platform for the needs of their mission. But what that enables us to do is offer a very, very low cost. It's about 1/10 the cost of our nearest competitor in terms of for the performance that you get. And so we're very excited. It's been so far, knock on wood. I'm a businessman, so you never want to take any business for granted. We work hard for every customer, but everything looks really good as far as our thinking 4 years ago when we set off on this journey, and where we are today with closing deals.
And this is so interesting, because it really does seem as if there is a sudden new movement in space, and new ideas, new
Yeah.
ways for people to innovate and to do space and to use space. And that brings me on to your association with the Small Satellite Alliance. It seems as if you're interested in more than just your own business in this, that you've got a wider sort of vision for small satellites. So please tell us about that organization.
Sure, I do. In fact, I founded the SmallSat Alliance when I realized that from my time in Washington that I mentioned before, that there are forces that try to weigh heavily on policy to keep things the way they always have been, and that can get in the way, not always, but it can get in the way of advancing sort of best value, if you will, for the government, for the taxpayer. And so I thought, well, heck, we're just one small company, but if we band together with a lot of our sisters and brothers in this business, we can form a virtual sort of team that'll be a force to reckon with. And so we quickly I brought on a partner for that business, if you will. And now we have about 55 companies in the alliance, and we advocate for across the US government for the purposes of introducing low-cost CubeSats, small satellites. I lump all that stuff as small satellites, but to do everything from NOAA, next generation weather prediction, climate change research, NASA as well. And then of course there's lots of activity going on in the classified world that obviously I can't talk about, but there's a lot going on there. And then also with Space Force and a lot of the building in some resiliency into a lot of architectures that, though exquisite and amazingly capable, they're quite vulnerable because they're these very large satellites that if one were to malfunction or somehow not work, the world could be blind, or NATO could be blind or inoperable in certain things, navigation, that kind of stuff. So.
Now, I know that all the students that have joined us today are going to know the answer to this very well. But for the benefit of our sort of online viewership, I wonder if you could talk us through this sort of the idea of the small satellite and the distinction between CubeSats, what they are, and then where you draw the line at what's a small satellite.
Well, everybody, there is some gray area there. In fact, some people ask about our York satellite, like how many U's is that? Because a CubeSat is typically measured in units, which is 10 centimeters on a side. And the original CubeSat was 1 U. It was a 10 centimeter cube. And we're able to have all the functions that you need for a satellite to operate in a 10 centimeter cube, which was remarkable. And it was fantastic for students. And then that gradually expanded because they thought, wow, if we do a 3U, then we can have a little bit bigger of an instrument payload on there and do some interesting things. And so it kind of grew that way. Where I would probably draw the distinction between, say, a CubeSat and then a satellite bigger than that, it's not really so much the size as it is the satellite itself based on the cube design? In other words, like a Lego block kind of design, or has it been redesigned from the beginning, kind of with a still very small, but redesigned with an explicit purpose from the onset, rather than sort of an evolution. So, for example, I'm sorry, just for example, there are small sats that are not CubeSats that are a third the size of York's satellite, and then there are, I would still consider satellites that are 2 or 3 times the size of York's satellite. We just chose the size that we chose because it seemed to hit the sweet spot in terms of business performance.
So the CubeSats have certainly taken me by storm, and the whole idea about them, the standardized components, the easy way that they can be put together. And clearly they have extraordinary value in allowing students hands-on experience of building satellites. From an industry perspective, what other role can CubeSats offer us? Are they destined to remain as educational, or can they be actually made sort of operational as well?
I think they can be made, and they are operational today, and so I think what we will gradually see over time is, and we already see this, but we'll see more of it, that form will follow the function. So if the idea for space data type is one that doesn't require a large satellite to collect it, but it gets a lot of strength from having 1,000 of these things on orbit, then I think that a CubeSat form factor will be right sized for that purpose. There's also it's a tremendous sort of vehicle for companies, startups, entrepreneurs to on ramp into something bigger. For example, we have at York, we have many CubeSat folks who are, as they did their prototyping and they got their first one up and they realized, oh, we can do so much more in terms of economic utility by adding 3 other things to it or whatever. And then so then they either that sometimes they'll want to use, they'll buy half of the use of one of our S class and partner with somebody else. And so it's very exciting time because there's all kinds of different ways that companies and businesses and governments can partner. Our platform is very inexpensive anyway, but sometimes if they want to make that leap from a very inexpensive, say 3U, but they want to get the performance and the design life, say 5 to 8 years on orbit, and all that kind of everything that goes with that, they can partner with somebody else. And we actually help make some of those partnerships happen. We bring 2 customers together that we think, oh, they want to be in the same orbit, the same inclination. Why don't you 2 kind of come together? We'll have one of our engineers work with you and figure out how to engineer that together. And that's a program within the York company called Hydra. And that's working out very well. It's very interesting. Some startups that are working on, for example, next generation spacecraft propulsion systems. They want to win the big contract to be a supplier to one of the big companies, but they need to get that flight heritage. Well, we offer a way by which they can get that flight heritage at a very low cost. For a few $100,000, they can get a ride up as a payload, test out their demonstrate, get some real data, test data back down, and then they can show that to potential customers, and then that's how they can on ramp to be a supplier, a merchant supplier of spacecraft propulsion to OneWeb or to any of the other big constellations. So it's a bit of a Wild West. It's very exciting, and candidly, I think this is the most exciting time to be in the space business probably since the 60s, because anything is possible. The barrier to entry is very, very low. There's lots of startup companies that have real business plans, and these young folks, women and men, are 23 years old, and they're starting with a credit card, and they're making it work, and they're building real businesses, and so it's a very, very exciting time.
Now we're going to return to this concept of the excitement of the time and the opportunity that it offers in a moment. But we've had a question in from one of the students who'd like to ask you about the satellite platforms and standardized satellite platforms. And this, it comes from, and I do apologize if I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly, Balaj. And he draws the point that cars, they don't need to update their platforms that often, but he feels that satellites can become obsolete quite quickly in, say, 6 months or so. How do you approach that from a business point of view, the march of technology and quick obsolescence?
Well, it's a good question, and in fact, it's one of the things where these smaller satellites, that form factor, lend themselves to, because one of the problems with the old satellites is that they were built in a time when people thought about designing for long endurance. So the satellites I worked on when I was young, the minimum design life was 15 years for these things. And that drives a lot of costs. But what we're finding is that, especially for low Earth orbit, we can use a lot of components that were designed for terrestrial use with a little bit of shielding, a little bit of, and we can use those. And if with a 3 to 5 year design life for a satellite, they can be replenished about on the same cadence as an iPhone. And I use the iPhone. Pardon me. I use the iPhone because I think that's a good example of where the state of the art is in terms of replacement. Of course, new things are always coming out every 6 months, but economically, people typically, unless you were Steve Jobs, you typically didn't replace your computer every 6 months, right? You typically about 3 years. So that's another. It's a great question, and it's actually one of the things that's driving us generally to move from GEO to LEO, and LEO large satellites to LEO more smaller ones.
And we'll return now, I think, to this idea that this moment is sort of is unique in space history. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on drawing that parallel to the 60s and now today. What's similar about that and what's different today?
Yeah, sure. I see a lot of similarities when I compare you're talking about the space business, comparing the space business of the 60s to today, so I would say that the excitement is as high today as it was in the 60s, but for a different reason. I think a lot of the excitement then was we didn't know what we were doing, but it was exciting, and we put some of the world's greatest engineers and scientists to work on it, and people were just excited to find out what they were going to find out. Was the moon made of cheese or not? That kind of a thing. I think today there's an excitement, and it parallels very much the computer industry. When I learned to program, it was all mainframe computers, and we had terminals, and we had and the terminals had replaced punch cards and stuff, and so it was all central processing, and there were no desktop computers or any of that kind of stuff. But when the desktop computer came, it put so much power so quickly in the hands of just an individual or a small business that very, very quickly it revolutionized everything. And those of us that are old enough to have witnessed that, they understand what I'm talking about. But it has become so easy to just create a business on the fly, like a lot of these space entrepreneurs are. And so it's just changed everything. And the satellite is going through a similar sort of transition where it was really the privilege of nation states to have satellites. And then there was, and then the space capability, then the capabilities of those nation states became available to ordinary citizens, for example, GPS and stuff like that. Then there was this evolution towards services. So you had the first generation of next space companies, next space, new space kinds of companies that were created services out of these things. Think of like the imaging things that Digital Globe, Maxar now, Black Sky, all those kinds of companies. What I see kind of happening into the future, because things are continuing to get less and less and less expensive, just like computers, we are going to see a world, and this is where I depart with a lot of my colleagues thinking about the future. I sort of see a world where, for better and for worse, a lot of companies have to think of themselves much like nation states, and they will have their own private constellations of satellites to do different functions. Whether it's collecting business intelligence, or it's secure communications, or it's highly secure data storage, where it's not even connected to the web, for example. I can see a lot of that going on, and much of that will be very, very affordable because satellites are becoming, they're not throwaway, but they're very inexpensive. Just as an example, York sells on the open market. There's only a few countries we can't sell this to. We sell an imaging satellite that has a capability that would have cost 20 years ago. Literally, I paid for $350 to $400 million for, and now we sell it on the open market for we can deliver it on orbit actually for less than $5 million. Deliver it on orbit, an imaging satellite. And that's opening up all kinds of interesting business opportunities and business possibilities for hundreds of countries and companies within those countries. So
it's absolutely fascinating. And the idea that we will now be able to launch so many more satellites much more inexpensively to do so many more things brings up the question of how much material is actually up there, how many satellites we're launching. And we've had a question in from Dave Vandermeer, and he would like to know, how has the awareness of space debris and the challenge that creates, how has that changed during the last 30 years?
It's changed a lot, but it hasn't changed enough, in my opinion. I'll just say it's a looming crisis, and it's not a crisis yet. And I hope it doesn't become one before we really take some leadership responsibility for that. But space debris is a big issue. But when you really kind of take that apart and you try to figure out, okay, what are the real problems? The real problems come from mostly truly debris, things that came from broken up old rocket bodies, maybe old satellites that were just kind of left for dead, if you will, that no longer were able to be maneuvered on orbit and that kind of thing. And so I think governments around the world know this. It's not an easy thing to get to, but we have to come up with some norms of behavior for low Earth orbit. We have that for geostationary orbit, but that's easier. As we all know, geostationary, it's parked basically over the same spot on the Earth, and so it's much easier to think through the policy issues with that. Any LEO satellite is going around the Earth every hour and a half, and it's traversing over other countries. Doesn't matter who launched it. That's just the way it works. And so getting all these countries to agree to norms of behavior is a challenge, but it's necessary. As the chairman of the alliance, the SmallSat Alliance, I do weigh in on these issues, and I try to represent all companies fairly. One of the things that is being talked about as one policy solution to this is to require onboard propulsion for all satellites, including CubeSats. But a lot of our members are not ready to do that yet, and so we're working through right now. What's a way by which we can encourage the innovation that CubeSats bring, but at the same time, when they reach a level of maturity or size or whatever, they become as responsible stewards of the space domain as anybody else. There's just one other thing related to that, where we look to a lot of the maritime law of the seas and all that kind of stuff to help guide us into how to think about the space sort of thing. And that works, except in one area that in this space debris thing, it kind of breaks down a little bit, and we're still trying to figure this one out. In open ocean, in open water, the larger craft has the right of way, and it's the smaller craft that has to maneuver out of the way of the big one. That's just a practical, it's not an ego thing, it's a practical thing. The challenge in the space business is that it's the big guys that actually have the ability to maneuver. The little guys don't. The smaller they are, well, like ours do, pardon me, York spacecraft do. We have onboard propulsion of different types for different customers and that kind of thing, but a lot of the smaller ones don't. And so we're trying to figure out what's a fair way to do that, because we want to encourage, we're a very pro-business type of endeavor. So we want to encourage entrepreneurialism and all that.
And we've got another question in here from Nilufar, And it's two questions here, and I think I'm going to ask them together because I think they relate to the point that you've just been making about stewardship of space and responsibility. And the first is: do the small satellite constellations, do they need the same levels of insurance as the big satellites? And the other thing is a practical question about communications, and if we're sending all these small satellites up there, they're all going to need to contact the Earth. And so do we run the risk of sort of congesting the electromagnetic spectrum with all the communications that are going to be coming to and from the Earth?
I love how all these folks are zeroing in on the policy things, because that's one thing that I didn't know, because I started off as an engineer, is how important all these policy things are to when you're thinking about business, because they do. For example, the first part of the question about business insurance, liability, all that, that's a huge thing. Underwriters, more than most people realize, drive much of and shape much of the business landscape in lots of industries, space included. And we're still sorting through that. There's all kinds of insurance in the space business. There's launch, you can insure against a loss during launch, on orbit, all the kind of things. There's company like York that guarantee performance. We don't take our final payment until the thing, first light or whatever, that kind of thing. But the insurance associated with liability, in other words, causing harm on somebody else, I'm not aware of anybody yet that has taken that one on. I hate to say it, but it'll probably take some kind of an accident or something like that, where there's a lawsuit before legislatures decide to act and try to bound that problem. It's a challenge. On the spectrum side, it's a very interesting question, because I've asked the same one. I've posited the same thing. Right now, in the US, you kind of need a launch license and you need spectrum license, but that's kind of it. And then if you're a communications system, and if you're remote sensing, then you have to get a license from NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association stuff, or administration. But it kind of doesn't, there really isn't a governance on the number of satellites. And so that's presenting an interesting issue, because it's so free market. It's such a Wild West right now. The question becomes, is it fair that just because somebody can afford to put up 1,000 or 2,000 satellites and they get their spectrum license, should they be allowed to do that? Because then those orbital slots become taken. And what's the adjudication on that? For geostationary telecommunication satellites, spectrum is everything. The orbital slot is important too, but the spectrum is a big deal. We have to sort through that, because you have a lot of billionaires rolling in. Do we want all the orbital slots to be taken up by a handful of folks? I don't know if that's the best. I'm not sure that's the best policy. In terms of spectrum itself and spectrum allocation, it's a good question. We always seem to, I've been in this business now for over 30 years, and we always seem to figure out ways to divide spectrum up. I'm not sure if we go to higher frequencies, as you know, Stuart, you're a physicist. I mean, you can go to higher frequencies, you can carry more data in a narrower bandwidth, right? And so that might be part of it. There's still the laser communication thing. It's funny, when I was coming up through the ranks and stuff, the joke used to be that laser communications is the technology of the future, and always will be. Because it was always seemed like there was somebody promising it, but it never quite made it. But I do think we're there. We're building a constellation of satellites for a customer that is predominantly laser communication, cross links and downlinks and everything. Anyway, so and we feel very, very good about the laser. We don't build the lasers, but we have a supplier for that. But so I think that one will sort itself out. It does get to this policy issue of how do we make this all kind of work for everyone in a fair way. And so hopefully some of these students are really interested in that and want to, maybe they're an entrepreneur for a couple of years, but then they want to get into the policy side of things, because it's its own area that folks need to roll up their shirt sleeves and get to work on.
Absolutely. And I think as well that the students are in the very best place as well, with Luxembourg sort of driving this conversation about how we want to use space, what the policy and regulation should be around that. Now, Chuck, you've been absolutely fantastic. You've been very generous in sharing your knowledge with us. We're going to give you a little bit of a break now because we'd like to hear now from Dr. Jan Theomel, who manages the CubeSat lab at the University of Luxembourg, and 2 of the 3rd semester ISM students. And they're going to tell us a bit about what they are currently working on. So over to you, Jan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Stuart. We also do small satellites here. We do very small satellites. We do CubeSat that were already mentioned. But we are a university. We do not produce satellites. We produce bright minds. And I have 2 of the very bright minds of this class here with me, Bishwait and Rod. We use satellites as a means to educate. And I'd like to give a presentation about that. I'll give a short insight first. 1 second. To educate the brightest minds that this university can produce, we founded the CubeSat lab here. Within this lab, we do education, but also research. We do theory and we do practice. For example, if we talk about the research, we have procured a satellite here, a CubeSat 3-unit CubeSat, that is near flight ready. It's just here on the desk. You must have seen it. And we use this satellite to practice operations, near real satellite operations. We connect that satellite to payloads of our befriended research groups here within the university. For example, there you see a radio for which we want to do a flight experiment for IoT and 5G in the near-term future. So that will be a very realistic and useful research. And we do the theory, and we do that very often with the students. We make them design a space mission. We see here one of the results, which is the education is, however, strongly linked to the research. We gave them a task that was very, very hard. We wanted to do something that has not been done before in this way. It was hard, but they set the standards for the students, for the new students, and for the years to come. But I would say we let them talk for themselves.
Thank you very much, Jan. I'm Bishwajit here. I'm along with my friend Rod. We are both from the first semester and the first cohort of the Interdisciplinary Space Master. What we have here is a very brief presentation on what we have been doing for almost 6 months now. This mission is called Crest, and it's kind of a poetic metaphor for the science that we have behind us. So Crest actually stands for Global Land Dampness Characterization using reflectometry by students. And for those who are maybe aware, or of course not aware, Crest is also the national bird of Luxembourg. But before we go into the very technical details of what we are doing with the mission, it is my pleasure to introduce you to the cohort of ISM that we have. ISM in itself is very unique. It's an incredibly diverse crowd, and not just in terms of nationality, but also the kind of backgrounds that these students have. For instance, we have Niloufer and Fazaneh. They are both from Iran. One is an electrical engineer, while Fazaneh is a chemical engineer. Larry, he's from Belgium. He's a finance and law consultant. I myself, I belong to India, and then I'm an aerospace engineer. We have Sophie and Michelle, both from USA. Sophie is an architect, and Michelle, an electrical engineer. We have Panayiotis, who is a physics background. And then we have Marius. Marius is served in the army as a telecommunications engineer. He's from Poland. We have Roman and Natalia. They are both Russians. Roman is a lawyer and Natalia an aircraft engineer. We have Dave, who is a robotics engineer. And then we have Rod, who is also from automation and robotics. Finally, we have Rui, who is a mechanical designer from China. At the end, I'd also like to introduce Dr. Jan Thomel. He has been the head of the entire program.
Thank you, Roy. Now I'll start presenting some of the characteristics of our CubeSat. A general characteristic is that, as we were talking before, CubeSats, they are measured in U sizes. And 1 U means that it's a satellite measuring 10 by 10 by 10 centimeters, very small. And talking about the main requirements of our mission, we placed our CubeSat in a LEO orbit, low Earth orbit, between 400 and 600 kilometers. And the goal of our mission was to measure the global soil moisture of the landmass of Earth. And going further into that, we went around Earth with maximum data latency of 1 week. We got data from the whole Earth, maximum 1 week, and resolution of 20 by 20 kilometers. Okay, now going to the subsystems. Here in this slide, I show you the payload, which is the main subsystem of our satellite and which carries the goal of the mission. The payload of our Crest is a GNSS receiver. GNSS receivers receive the signals, either direct or reflected, sent from the navigation satellites. And the measurement method that we apply is the GNSS reflectometry, which is capable of getting the signals, and on board we generate the delayed Doppler maps, which directly reflect the soil moisture of Earth round.
Now, of course, payload is the most important part of the satellite, but then we need other systems that actually support it. So we divided ourselves into 6 teams, of which 4 are the supporting subsystems. We had power, which had to ensure the power team, which we had to ensure that they provide power, enough power to all the subsystems. Then we have the communication team, which had to ensure that they provide reliable communication with the Gold Crest satellite. We plan to have at least 1 ground station in Luxembourg. And at the same time, we have to ensure that the high data output that we are having due to a continuous monitoring, that is being delivered within 1 week. The ADCS team has to take care of detumbling and also attitude control. They also had to ensure that with enough accuracy, the payload is pointing back at Earth. The ADCS team had a major challenge in terms of fitting the whole package within a small 1U CubeSat. Finally, we have the onboard computer team. They were tasked with managing the commands and also the telecommunications. One point here is that we wanted to know whether we can pre-process the data or send it or process it on the satellite itself, but we were quite limited by power there. Before we go to the final configuration of the satellite, I'd like to show how we organize ourselves in a team. Usually in such a project, we have something like a project team, which kind of drives down decisions. But then we are students and we are equals, so we did not want someone to boss over us. We had a decentralized decision-making process, and we ensured that all decisions have a general consensus. But that doesn't mean that we had an ad hoc decision-making tree. We were very clear in defining our priorities. We put payload and power at the highest of our priority and decided what they wanted and what is available. Then we go to communications at second priority, and they kind of said, okay, this is what we require in terms of the systems. Then finally, ADCS and OBC, they are supporting roles which ensured that the 3 prior teams had all their requirements met. Finally, all these systems would go through system. We would see if it fits within our 1U, otherwise we send it back for another iterative cycle. This process was, of course, helped by experts in GNSS reflectometry, satellite communications, and also external experts on power systems. To give you a general timeline of our progress, we commenced in October 2019, And then we already accomplished a 1.5U configuration by January 2020. Finally, in July of 2020, we were able to achieve our 1U goal.
So here we present you the final configuration of our project, our mission. And I would like to go through all the subsystems here that we show in this picture. And the first one, the top corner, you see the GNSS receiver, which is the payload, both directing zenith up and nadir down. We have two receivers. Then the second one that I would like to point to is the communication part. We have the antennas and also the communication board for UHF radio. The third one is the power system. We have the EPS board as well as the solar panels, which one of them is deployable on the satellite. The fourth one is the ADCS, Attitude Determination and Control Subsystem, which has a Y reaction wheel and also magnetometers for a 3-axis stabilization. On the outside structure of the CubeSat, we also have quartz sun sensors, which help on the maneuvers and so on. The last one, but not least, we have the OBC, onboard computer, which is also stacked in the structure of the CubeSat.
Before we go to the last slide, I would like to just go through one of the results that we had during the course of our study. The CubeSat itself is a major challenge in terms of trade-offs that we have to do. As you saw in the previous slide, it is extremely small. We cannot produce enough power. As a thumb rule, a 1U CubeSat can produce only 1 watt of power. But that was not enough for our application, which was quite novel right now. So what we had to do is somehow increase that power. Either there's one direction that we go towards the orbit, or we kind of increase the solar panels. When we went with the entire team, we first looked at the mission studies. We realized that staying at the popular 1030 orbit is not going to work for us. We have to move to the 6 AM orbit, which allows us to produce maximum power. So with our studies, we found out that the average power that we can generate is almost 2.6 watts, which is more than double of the thumb rule of a 1 watt satellite. This power is going to be maximum at 3.6 watts during the entire course of the satellite. This is just a snapshot, but then Rod will take you to the final outcome.
Yes, so the main result of our project was, as Ian was pointing very well in the beginning, the miniaturization. So when we can bring the subsystems that we see in bigger satellites from 3U to 6U to small sats into a cube of 10 by 10 centimeters and still achieve the same result, that was very fascinating to us, and we accomplished that. And we accomplished that using an agile design. We were using CubeSat modularity and off-the-shelf components, meaning that our group and other groups that want to implement the same design can do it very fast and put it to flight very fast as well. And last, we did all of that amid this pandemic that we have been living right now. We started in the very beginning in person, but during the course of the project, we had to shift to completely remotely. And with that, we had to learn how to use the tools that we were learning and collaborate in a completely new environment for everyone. So with this, I would also like to thank you very much, Professor Dr. Tony and Sajad and Jorge, which in their expertise helped us a lot throughout the project. And thank you, everyone that is watching, Mr. Beams also. And I pass the word back to you if you have any questions or any additional information. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. If you could just stop sharing the screen, that's perfect. Thank you. So first of all, let me offer my congratulations for what you have achieved and the goals that you're pursuing here. It's a true inspiration for me to hear about what you're doing and a real sort of vision for the future. So congratulations. Charles, how closely do what these students are going through, how closely does that resemble sort of the space industry today?
Well, I have to tell you, Stuart, I'm really impressed, really impressed. And I remember having dinner with Etienne Schneider years ago, and he was talking about his vision for Luxembourg and space and how he wanted to create a Luxembourg Space Agency and all these kinds of things. And it warms my heart to see it coming to fruition. And one of those key pieces was the university and having this university program. And I'm really impressed. It's tracking very well. Clearly, the folks that are running that program understand how to get students to think about the whole problem, not just a very narrow thing, and think comprehensively. I just had a couple of thoughts, if it's useful, from the presentation. One is that, I forget which student it was, because the picture gets very small, but one of the students mentioned about the leadership thing and how they're all equal. And so that presented its own challenge. And I will say to you that actually that's perfect training, because the most effective leaders do not use the fact that they're the boss to lead their teams, but they actually use various forms of consensus building to keep motivation high and get high productivity out of teams. So what you're learning there in the team environment at the university are great skills that you'll be able to apply in industry. The other thought that I had, which I just happened to really like, the fact that you chose soil moisture as sort of something to get into, because it is something that has applicability to so many different areas. And obviously this is a CubeSat project, but I can tell you that soil moisture is an indication of all kinds of things. And most recently, if folks haven't seen it, there's a great show on Netflix called Kiss the Ground. And it talks about actually a lot of scientists are now thinking that one of the big solutions to our climate issues in terms of carbon capture is in the soil itself. It's actually in the billions of organisms that live in the soil that actually capture carbon, and moisture is an important part of that. And so being able to track that and know what parts of the world are getting too dry and what needs to be done about that, this is an important first step. So hats off to you for choosing this as a project, and I'm very excited. My best to Luxembourg, my best to the university, the professors there, and the students, and the folks that put this together have my contact information. So if folks want to contact me, they can go through, I think Colleen would be a good way to do that. So anyway, thank you very much, Stuart, for hosting.
Oh, thank you, Chuck. It's all down to you. We've had a great time. You've been so generous with your background and your vision for the future of space industry. It's been such a pleasure talking to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
And you. So thanks again to Asteroid Foundation and Luxembourg Space Agency, Broadcasting Centre Europe, SES Satellites, Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce, Eurocomposites, OHB Systems, and B612 Foundation for making this program possible. We'll see you for the next SpaceConnectsUs. Goodbye.
Are you ready to launch your career in space?
3, 2, 1.
Go. The Interdisciplinary Space Master at the University of Luxembourg is your opportunity to break into the space industry.
From day one, you'll gain both technical and business knowledge of space missions and operations. Developed in partnership with the Luxembourg Space Agency, the ISM uses a project-based learning approach.
That means you get to apply your knowledge in a variety of exciting labs, collaborate with other students, and learn from academic and industry experts.
Luxembourg's space industry is growing at a fast pace. Don't miss the chance to learn from leading experts in the field. Are you ready to embark on a journey beyond the atmosphere?